Hi, everyone. Welcome and good evening. My name is Lauren Artilles, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, the Harvard University Division of Science, and the Harvard Library, I'm honored to introduce this virtual event with David Eagleman, presenting his latest book, Live Wired, The Inside Story of the Ever-Changing Brain, with a special introduction by Harvard's own Alvaro Pascual-Leone. I hope you're all well and safe. Thank you so much for joining us virtually. Tonight's event is the latest installment in our Harvard Science Book Talk series, which works to bring the authors of recently published science literature to our Cambridge community and beyond. Coming up in the series this Thursday, May 20th at 5 p.m., we'll host neuroscientist Russell Poljack for his new book, Hard to Break: Why Our Brains Make Habits Stick, in conversation with Harvard professor Elizabeth Phelps. To learn more about this and our other upcoming virtual events, you can visit harvard.com and sign up for our email newsletter, or check out the page harvard.com/science for more info. I'll also be sharing a link in the chat to our Science Research Public Lectures YouTube channel, where you can view previous talks that you might have missed. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. So if you have a question for our author at any time during the talk tonight, click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get through as many as time allows. In the chat, I'll be posting a link to purchase LiveWired on harvard.com, as well as a link to donate in support of this series and our store. Your purchases and financial contributions make events like tonight's possible and help ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore. So thank you. Thanks to our partners at Harvard University, and thank you to all of you for showing up and tuning in support of authors, publishers, indie bookselling, and especially for science. And finally, as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings this last year, actually, technical issues may arise. So if they do, we'll do our best to resolve them as quickly as possible. Thank you for your patience and understanding. And now I'm excited to turn things over to Alvaro Pascual-Leone, professor of neurology and director of the Berenson Allen Center for Non-Invasive Brain Stimulation at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center and Harvard Medical School. The digital podium is all yours, Alvaro.
Thank you so very much, Lauren. Thank you for the opportunity to reach out to all of you, and thank you for your interest in the upcoming presentation by David Eagleman. It's my pleasure to be presenting him. Not that he needs a presentation, but nonetheless, I'll tell you a little bit of the things, of the many things he's accomplished, and hopefully whet your appetite even more for his talk and presentation of his book. So David is a really very well recognized and respected neuroscientist with over 120 peer-reviewed scientific publications. But he is probably even better known because of his impact in making sure that the science reaches and benefits people, all of us in our lives. And so he's done that in a variety of different ways. He is a award-winning author of many books. We're going to hear about his latest, but the books range from fiction to different areas of brain-related aspects, from cognition to consciousness to sensory interactions, synesthesias. He's also an Emmy-nominated, award-winning presenter and host and creator of The Brain, a series that I personally have greatly enjoyed, and that has a fantastic companion book, The Brain, The Story of You. I would highly recommend catching up with that, and you can binge on his Netflix The Creative Brain series. Finally, he's the founder of a number of companies, two particular ones that he continues to direct and are doing enormously cutting-edge work in benefiting people today. Sensory that helps cope with hearing problems by interactions between sensory systems, and BrainCheck that enables all of us to get assessments of our well-being, our cognitive function, and our brain health to develop early interventions. With all that accomplishment, he's broadly recognized with a number of awards, including the McGovern Award for Excellence in Biomedical Communication, and I'm sure you're going to enjoy that amazing ability of convey complex issues to the public, as he tells us about his latest book on brain plasticity, an area in a particular focus of brain science that I'm particularly interested in myself. So thank you, David, and please take it away.
Great. Thanks so much, Alvaro. It's a pleasure. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here at the Harvard Bookstore. I wish I were here in person, but maybe next book we'll make that happen. And yeah, and thank you, Alvaro, for being here to introduce me. Some of you who saw The Brain know that I was very pleased and honored to have Alvaro on the show talking about his very important work. He's been someone I've always admired and looked up to in the field, so it's really great to be here. So here, I'm going to share my slides. And okay, great. So here's what I figured I'd do was, keep my remarks to about 30 minutes at most, and then open it up to discussion so that we can track any questions that that come up that you guys have. So let's get started. So the issue that's always been fascinating to me is when you look across the animal kingdom, what you find is, flexibility and adaptability everywhere, but fundamentally there is a spectrum of how flexible brains are across the animal kingdom. So, your dog can learn new tricks, but it's limited. And there's something very special about human brains. And one way that you can see this is when you fly over a forest and you look out the window, and it looks essentially exactly the same as it did 100,000 years ago. The same animal species are doing their things and messing around. But when you get to your destination city, the landscape has been so influenced by one single species that it looks like a motherboard has risen out of the earth. And this one species has taken over every corner of the planet, invented the internet, and discovered quantum gravity and bounded off the planet and so on. So the question is, what is so special about this one species? So here's one way we can get at this. I don't know if any of you have ever seen a baby zebra get born, but it can run in about 45 minutes. And it's the same with baby giraffes, and baby dolphins actually are born swimming. But if you've ever seen a baby Homo sapien get born, you may have noticed that it's a different story there. And this is because instead of trying to hardwire everything in at birth, what Mother Nature discovered with us was a simpler and more flexible strategy, which is allow neurons to self-modify based on their experience. And so what this means is you can't really think about the brain as hardware. You can't think about it as software, but instead it's what I call liveware. And in the field, we call this brain plasticity. I'll tell you why I prefer the term liveware. It's because plasticity was coined by William James a century ago, and he was impressed with, plastic manufacturing, the way you can mold something into shape and it holds on to that shape. But the fact is, what's going on in the brain is you've got 86 billion neurons, the specialized cell type of the brain, and these are constantly in motion, and they're plugging and changing their strength and unplugging and reseeking and plugging in elsewhere. It's an entire living forest of unimaginable size happening under the hood. And so I wanted a term that was better than something that compared it to plastic. So I've introduced the term liveware for this purpose. And, the scoop is that brains come into the world half-baked, human brains. They come into the world half-baked and they absorb the world around them. And this has been this massively useful trick by Mother Nature. It's no other species has done what we've done, and it's because they don't have the capacity to absorb the world to the degree that we do. You have to relearn how to be a dog in each generation. But we drop into the world, and in a handful of years, we have learned almost every important insight and discovery of the billions of humans that have come before us. And then we get to go and springboard off of that into the next generation. So what I want to do in today's short talk is I just want to give 4 highlights about brain plasticity, about live wiring. that I find fascinating for just principles of this. So the first one is that, there's this interesting analogy that we always have between computers and brains, and we call it memory in both of them, and we think of them as being sort of similar, but brains are doing something so different than the way we think about computers or any of our machines. And so I'll just give you a couple of examples like this. So this was a case some years ago about a 44-year-old man who had a normal IQ. He went to the doctor because of some leg pain. The doctor couldn't figure out why he was having leg pain, so he sent the man to get a brain scan just in case they found something there that could explain it. So I'm just going to show you, this is a picture of a normal brain scan. So this is just, a slice down this way of the brain. I'm not going to draw too much attention. Just look at number 3. That's what's called the lateral ventricle. It's this volume in the brain that has fluid in it, cerebrospinal fluid. Anyway, when they imaged this guy, here's what they found in his brain. He had something called hydrocephaly, which causes increased pressure, and that fluid essentially squished the brain up against the edges of his skull. So this is what his brain looked like. But he didn't have any problems. He was married, he had a family, he had a job. And this illustrates the remarkable flexibility of this material. We don't know how to build something like this. You can't take your phone and, squish it or smash half of it or something and hope that it still works. But liveware is a completely different kind of beast. And in my hometown where I grew up, Albuquerque, New Mexico, there was a boy named Matthew, and he got this terrible epilepsy that affected one whole half of his brain, a hemisphere of his brain. And it's called Rasmussen's encephalitis. And it turns out there's really only one solution for this, which is what's called a hemispherectomy, where you remove half of the brain. And in fact, when the surgery first started, they would fill that half with sterile ping pong balls to hold the other half of the brain up, but they realized they didn't need to after a while because of the fluid pressure. But this is such a stunning thing to remove half the brain. And the reason it's so stunning is because the kids are essentially totally normal. They tend to have a limp on the other side of their body. They have a slight limp and weakness of their limbs, but cognitively, they're just fine. They can do math, they can read, they can go through school just fine. And there are an enormous numbers of examples of this kind of thing in the book Livewire. And this is why I, am so intrigued by the brain, is because it's very different from what we know how to build in Silicon Valley or Boston or anywhere else in the world, because it's not like hardware and software that we know how to think about. By the way, this is just a quick side note, but the surgeon who pioneered these radical hemispherectomies, does anyone know who this is? This is Ben Carson. Strange, but true. So, what everyone thinks about is politics. He is the father of these amazing surgeries. So, the point is that I wanted to introduce this as the first way of thinking that we're not dealing with something like the tech that we know how to build. Okay, so principle number 2 that is amazing is that brains match themselves to their inputs. So this is a picture of Admiral Lord Horatio Nelson, who, if you've been to London, he towers over Trafalgar Square and his portraits are everywhere. But a surprising number of people never noticed that he's actually missing his right arm. And the reason is because his arm was shot off with a musket gun at one of the naval battles that he was in. So it turns out that when you look at, you look inside the brain, what you find is there's a map of the body in the brain. There's, both for the feeling from the body and also the commands that go and move the body around. And when this was first discovered, people thought, okay, well, look, if the brain locked in silence and darkness has a map of the body, perhaps it's genetically pre-specified. But it turns out it's not, because when the body changes, the map changes also. So if you lose your arm, like Horatio Nelson, then the map changes accordingly. It's constantly representing what the body looks like now. And an analogy I make in the book is it's like, it's like a battle for territory. So if you look at something like early North America, you see that these different empires had different grips on the New World. And this had everything to do with how many ships they were sending over. So they were all sending ships and people and men, and and in fact the French sent over a bunch of women as well, and they eventually started realizing that they were losing their grip on the New World, so they sent over prisoners. They did what they could, but in the end the French simply were not shipping over enough people to keep a hold on their territory. And in contrast, the British were shipping over a lot of people, and so they were taking over that territory. So the lesson that the French learned is that colonization is a full-time business. You can't just sort of do it and hope something's going to stick. You have to keep sending people. And this is the story that constantly plays out in the brain. So when a part of the body no longer sends information, it loses territory. So Admiral Nelson's arm was France, and his cortex was the New World. And it started off with a healthy colonization. His arm was sending spikes up into the brain. And in Nelson's youth, it staked out a healthy territory, but then came a musket ball and the amputation. And now his brain was receiving no new input from that part of the body. And so the arm lost its real estate. And we see this all the time. We see this with, for example, when a person goes blind, when his eyes are damaged, signals are no longer coming in along the pathways to the occipital cortex. So that part of the brain becomes no longer visual. The ships that are carrying visual data have stopped arriving. So this coveted territory is taken over by the competing kingdoms of sensory information like sound and touch. So this is brain imaging from another group showing that when a person is blind, that the visual cortex, what we would have thought of as the visual cortex, this part of the brain, the occipital lobe, is getting activated by sound and by touch. Now, one of the things that has really inspired me and inspired some of my thinking for the book is how rapidly this kind of territory takeover happens. So in one study in 2007 that Alvaro was involved in, participants were tightly blindfolded, and they were put in a scanner, and they were asked to perform a touching task that required fine discrimination with their fingers, and their brains were getting imaged. And so what the investigators at Harvard found is that there was, activity emerging in the primary visual cortex, but this was after about an hour. So in other words, touch was leading to activity in the visual cortex. Now, the thing is, this is an extremely fluid system, and the fact that touch was taking over and starting to show up there is no surprise, but the surprise was the sheer speed of it. And so it's not like the brain shifts at the speed of, continental plates and glacial drifting, but this can be really swift. And, we can talk in Q&A if anyone wants about how those changes happen so rapidly. But the point of this is, this got me thinking about, I started chewing on this years ago when that study came out. And I realized that this led me to a whole new hypothesis about why we dream at night. And the idea is this: in the chronic competition for brain real estate, everybody is competing, trying to take over. The visual brain in particular has a unique problem to deal with because of the rotation of the planet. It gets cast into darkness for an average of 12 hours every cycle. And obviously I'm talking about the majority of our evolutionary history, not our current electricity blessed times. And what we know is that sensory deprivation triggers neighboring territories to take over. So how does the visual system deal with this unfair disadvantage? And the suggestion is that it does this by keeping the occipital cortex active during the night. In other words, dreaming exists to slam activity into the visual cortex. And if you look at the circuitry for dreaming, it's extremely specific. You get these activations in your midbrain that blast activity into just the primary visual cortex every 90 minutes through the night. And the idea is that, the rotation of the planet doesn't affect anything about your ability to hear or touch or smell or taste or anything. It's only vision that suffers in the dark. And so the visual cortex every night finds itself in danger of a takeover by the senses. And given the startling rapidity with which changes in territory can happen, this is a meaningful threat. And so dreams are the brain's way of fighting the takeover from the other senses. So, we published data on this. We, just as one example of the latest thing, we very carefully examined 25 species of primates and how plastic they are, how flexible their brains are, and how much REM sleep they get, rapid eye movement sleep, they get each night. And it turns out this correlates perfectly, which is to say the more flexible a species like us, Homo sapiens, we get the most dream sleep, and others like, some primates that are not particularly flexible at all, they get very little dream sleep. And so anyway, look up the paper if you're interested, but if anyone wants just a general overview, we also put this in Time Magazine recently, sort of a general way of understanding this. Okay, great. That's number 2. Number 3, the brain wraps around new data streams. So one of the things I want to emphasize is that, when you look at the cortex, it looks about the same everywhere. And that's because it is the same everywhere. So even though we say, oh, this is visual cortex, and that's auditory cortex, and somatosensory cortex, and so on, it's exactly the same stuff. It's, a very particular circuit with 6 layers. And what it gets defined by is what gets fed into it, what data cables are plugging in where. And so there's a lot about this in the book, but let me just say that one of the things that this allows is that you can plug in new data cables and the brain will just figure out what to do with that. You can feed in new data and, the brain just figures out what it's going to do with it. So this is a talk that I gave at TED a few years ago. In my lab, we built a vest covered with vibratory motors, and the vest captures sound. So this is for people who are deaf. The vest captures sound, turns into pattern of vibrations on the skin. It's mapped from low to high frequency. So this is what it looks like. So as I'm speaking, the sound is getting translated into dynamic patterns of vibration. I'm feeling the sonic world around me. So here's what this looks like, just to give you a sense. So the woman on the left is saying the word sound, and you can see it going from low to high. On the right, she's saying the word touch, which has the motors on the shoulders. And so for people who are deaf, this allows them to feel the sound. Now, the thing is that this information is coming in, going up the spinal cord into the brain. It's not going to the normal part that we would think of as being involved in hearing, but the brain can figure out what to make of these signals. How? By correlating it with what it sees. So if you see a dog barking and you're feeling a particular something, or you see someone's mouth moving and you feel a particular something, it's not that hard to figure out how to use it. So here was our very first participant. So he's on the left. This is my graduate student, Scott, on the right. So Scott says a word.
You.
So he says the word you. Jonathan on the left is completely deaf. He feels the vibration on his vest. He writes on the board what he thinks he's heard.
Where?
So Scott says where. Jonathan is able to translate this complicated pattern of vibrations into an understanding of what's being said.
Touch.
Now, Jonathan's not doing this consciously as such because the patterns are very complicated, but his brain is having no problem unlocking the pattern. So when you were a baby, you had to learn how to use your ears. Your brain is just seeing all these spikes come in, and you figure it out with time. You figure out what it means to see a mouth moving and feel these things coming in, and you start realizing what to make of sounds. And of course, you're making your own sounds and so on. And his experience of hearing, if this helps anyone to think about it like a blind person reading Braille, passing their finger over Braille. The meaning comes directly off the page without conscious intervention for them. They're not thinking, okay, there's a bump and another bump and another bump and so on. Instead, they're just reading the book and they're laughing or they're crying because it's just a way of getting the information in there, even though most of us are used to reading squiggles on a page and getting the information in there that way. Okay, so we recently had National Geographic out to our offices. This was just before the pandemic. Here's a deaf participant, but he's not the reason they were there. It's because of his daughter, who was born both deaf and blind. So we made a miniature vest for her. And you can see on the phone here, I'm showing you the frequencies that are getting captured as we're all talking. And so we're sending this information to her. And this is the first information that she's had from this part of the world. And so here's her grandmother's carrying her around and touching her feet against things, saying, this is soft, this is hard. On the right, the bed is going down and up. And so that the grandmother's saying down, 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 up, up, up. And this is how you learn. This is how you learn how to understand the signals, exactly as you learned how to use your ears. What we did next, by the way, is we shrunk this down so that for children who are deaf, they could just wear this as a chest strap. But actually, we've gone past this, because what we're doing now, we have been doing for the last couple of years, is we made this into a wristband. And the wristband has vibratory motors, and it has very sophisticated processing in the main bit of it there. So it's capturing sound and turning into patterns of vibration directly on the skin. So here's a video of our first subject using this. He was using an earlier prototype, but just give you a sense of, I just want to give you a sense of what it feels for a deaf person to wear this, what it means to them. So we're on, as I said, wrists all over the world, and I'll skip over this. Let me just mention this. This is a word cloud of sounds that users have come back to us. They've spontaneously reported to us that they've been able to pick up on things that they didn't even sometimes know were things, or they were surprised by it. I mean, everyone's surprised that microwaves make beeps and stuff like that. So the reason I think this matters a lot is because, the only other option for people who are deaf is a cochlear implant, which is $100,000 when you add the tech plus the surgery. And our vest, our wristband, we can build for way over 100 times, less expensively. And so what that means is that opens up this technology globally, even for the poorest countries in the world. And so one of the things we're doing on the side is getting this into deaf schools all over the world now. And so, great. So I just want to mention, because we can feed different kinds of information to the brain and it can figure it out, one of the things we've been doing is using this tech to feed in any sort of data. So here's an example with the vest, but we're feeding in 9 different measures from a quadcopter. So pitch, yaw, roll, heading, orientation. And that improves this pilot's ability to fly it, because it's essentially like he's extending his skin up there to the drone. He's becoming one with the drone. And because the brain can figure out, okay, I'm watching the drone, I see what it's doing, and I'm feeling it, it's very easy to learn how to do this. We've done experiments with direct perception of social media. So just as an example, scraping Twitter for any hashtag, doing an automated sentiment analysis on it, positive, negative, neutral, and feeding that to people in real time. And that's a new kind of human experience, by the way, to be plugged into the aggregate emotion of thousands of people in real time. It's a bigger experience than a human can normally have. I'm a scientific advisor for the television show Westworld. And so I put our vest in that. So now I call it Vestworld. And, here's just a quick example of it. So let me show you. So she's looking at the vest on the screen, but if you look at this military contractor in the middle, look at the lights on his vest. He's wearing our vest. And the point is that in this world, 30 years in the future, when he feels the buzzing of the vest, it tells him the location of the bad robots, the hosts. And so he's able to dispatch them accordingly, because he's feeling their 3-dimensional location around him on the vest. And so, here they weren't expecting a host to be there. They get killed. So that just goes to show that my tech won't help anybody if AI goes bad. But I will say that what we're doing is, this idea of being able to detect 3-dimensional space around you. This is something that we actually are doing. So for people who are blind, we're using LiDAR to detect everything going on around them so they can feel the location of all of the people around them, including behind them. So, you feel like, oh, somebody's coming up by my left. Oh, now they're moving around behind me. They're coming closer, farther. And on top of that, it's easy for us to add navigation, which is what we're doing here. So he's never been here before. We're telling him go straight, go left, go to the right. This was actually a tricky one here because it was a conference room at 45 degrees, but he was able to find it quite easily. So anyway, in a sense, this is better than sighted vision in that you know exactly where everyone is around you in 360 degrees. So this is, I have much more to say about this topic. If anyone's interested in this, check out my company Neosensory. But that's all I want to say in the context of this talk. And it's not just senses. The brain can figure out how to control whatever body it finds itself in. So I mentioned earlier with, Admiral Nelson that, these maps of the body and the brain, they're not genetically pre-specified. And so whatever your body plan is, the brain has no trouble figuring that out. So just as an example, you ride a bicycle or you hang glide or you scooter or you jump on a trampoline or a pogo stick or whatever, the brain says, oh yeah, okay, it takes takes a little time. And then it says, I got it. I'm able to roll with this. And, one example that I've always loved is there's this dog that was born named Faith who didn't have front legs. And so she just learned how to walk bipedally. And, it's not that hard for her to learn that. She needed to learn it in order to get to her mother and get to, drink and food and to get what she needed out of life. And so it's not that dogs can't walk bipedally. It's just that most of them aren't particularly motivated to do it. But this also means, again, the dog brain is not genetically pre-specified to drive the dog body. It normally has 4 legs to work with, but it doesn't have to. And you find the same thing in humans all the time. This is Matt Stutzman, who's the world's best archer. He has the world record for the longest shot in archery, but he has no arms. But he got interested in archery, so he figured out how he was going to do it with his feet and his legs, and then he's able to shoot accurately for incredible distances. There are many. This is from my PBS show, The Brain, but there are labs all over the nation and the world now doing this sort of thing where you implant electrode grids into a patient's motor cortex. And you have them control a robotic arm. So this is for people who are paralyzed, let's say from the neck down. This is this unbelievably sophisticated, beautiful robotic arm. And half the challenge is for the researchers to be able to read the signals and decode them so that this woman Jan can move the arm. But the other half of the challenge is for Jan to figure out how to do it. In other words, when she tries to move the arm, it doesn't do what she wanted to do. But because of the flexibility of her brain, she learns how it is she's going to control it, just like you learn how to control a bicycle or a skateboard or anything like that. And I think this is part of the future of what's going on with robotics. I think this is what will happen in robotics, is that instead of pre-programming the robot, you let the robot test hypotheses to figure out its own body. So this is from a colleague of mine, Hod Lipson, who made this starfish robot that has no idea what it looks like. It puts out signals, it sees what happens, and it figures out how to walk this way. This looks really creepy. I know this is the starfish robot, but the point is, what you can do then is you can snap off a limb and let the robot refigure out how it's going to walk. But the point is, you don't need to tell it what its body is, and that's exactly what the human brain, that's the lesson we've derived from the human brain. You don't need to pre-program, it just figures it out. Okay, the very last thing I want to do is say that your brain comes to reflect what you do. Your brain is changing all the time, and it's a matter of how you are spending your time and what you're doing. And so there have been many studies over the last 20 years showing that, for example, when humans, adults, not babies, challenge themselves to learn how to do something new, like juggle or take on a new musical instrument, you can see changes with the naked eye in brain imaging, fMRI. You can see the changes that are resulting from taking on new tasks. So what you do actually changes the structure of your brain. And you can see this with great detail, for example, for, let's say, a piano player versus a violinist. A colleague of mine at Harvard, Gottfried Schlag, showed this some years ago, which is that, you can look at the brain. For a violin player, they're really just using their left hand in great detail, and the right hand is just bowing. But for a pianist, they're using both hands in great detail. They have to really train up what both hands are doing. And so this strip here, we're looking at the top of the brain. The strip here called the motor cortex actually, gets bigger and has to squish more in there. And you can see the difference there. And so, it's quite remarkable, this stuff. And I'll just mention one thing. And Alvaro and I were just talking about this before this started, which is, this is what a healthy brain looks like, a slice of a healthy brain, and this is what it looks like with advanced Alzheimer's. But there's a study that's been going on for a long time now called the Religious Order Study, where, for example, nuns were examined. All these nuns who were living in convents agreed that they would give up their brains upon death to get autopsy, to examine it. So many, many nuns did this. And what was quite stunning is that it was discovered from the study that many of these nuns had Alzheimer's disease. Their brains looked more like they did on the right here. And yet they weren't having any cognitive problems. You wouldn't have known that they had Alzheimer's disease. And so this is because these women lived in the convents till their dying day, and they had chores and responsibilities, and they played games, and they drove places, and they had dinners together, and they had all kinds of things going on in their life, as opposed to, what often happens when people retire is that their lives shrink a lot, and they end up sitting on the couch and watching Jerry Springer or something, but they're not challenging themselves. They're not constantly in a social context doing things. And Alvaro is actually, he's running this Barcelona study, which is a very large scale study that is also looking at this sort of thing. And he was just telling me before that one of the things they find is that this correlates with if you have a well-defined purpose in life. The purpose in life seems to be the main driver of people, for example, having Alzheimer's, but not having the cognitive deficits that you would expect. And a colleague of ours has called this cognitive reserve, which is to say, even though your brain is physically degenerating, if you are challenging it all the time, you're building new roadways. There's new stuff happening. There's new bridges and roadways, even as parts of it are falling apart. And this is what's, let me just suffice it to say, this is one of the most important things for anybody who's thinking about retiring, or you have parents who are retired or grandparents. Just make sure that you stay cognitively active and find purpose in life. Okay. And then the very last thing, and this is how I end the book with a chapter on this, is this issue about, as we come to start opening up these secrets of the brain, of how the brain actually works and does this incredible live wiring all the time, that's going to allow us to build a completely new kind of device. We're not, as I said, here in Silicon Valley and in Boston and everywhere else, everybody here is very proud of their neat trim hardware with the software layer that sits on top, and that's the whole thing. But it's a very different ballgame when you start thinking about liveware. So just as one example, look at the Mars rover Spirit that went up some time ago. So Spirit did a great job, actually. Went around the Martian landscape, found all kinds of stuff. But what happened is it eventually got its right front wheels stuck in the Martian soil, and it died. That was the end of it. It couldn't get out. And so this, $1 billion project turned into, space garbage. And so if you contrast that with something like a wolf, which gets its leg caught in a trap, what does it do? It chews its leg off, and it figures out how to walk with 3 legs. Because unlike Spirit, the leg-trapped wolf operates with ambitions. It has to reach safety. It has to seek water. It has to escape danger. It has to find food. And so its actions and intentions are undergirded by the demands of its stomach and the threat of predators. And so the wolf is always trafficking in deference to goals. And as a result, its brain drinks up information about the environment and about its capabilities in that environment. And it translates that into the most useful outputs. So the wolf carries on with a limp, because animals don't shut down with moderate damage, and neither should our machines. So in the last part of the book, I talk about what I see as the future, the biological future of machinery. So I'm going to stop talking there so that we have plenty of time for Q&A. Thank you so much for being here today, and I'll look forward to any questions.
Hey, thank you so much for that fascinating talk. We've got some great questions lined up, and if you have any that you haven't entered yet, please enter them in the Q&A box below. I am going to start with this question from Jane, who's asking, do you know anything about aphantasia, inability to make mental images, and where could she possibly learn more about it?
Yeah. So this is an area that I'm doing a lot of writing about, and I actually, I'm teaching a new course right now at Stanford called Literature in the Brain, and I'm talking a lot about this issue because I've noticed that different authors write so differently in terms of their visual description. Here's what it is. Normally, we have very rich mental imagery. I mean, everyone, if I say, look, picture an ant crawling over a red and white picnic blanket to a jar of purple jelly, you have some kind of image in your mind of that. But it turns out that at the edge of the distribution across the population, some people don't picture anything at all, and that's called aphantasia. Some people have like a clear movie, and that's called hyperphantasia. So it turns out that the clarity at which you visualize something differs a lot from person to person. And so I find this a very interesting topic. I've published on this. Let's see, where can you learn more about it? There's something called, I think it's called the Aphantasia Network online, where it's a whole bunch of people with aphantasia talking about it. And by the way, one of the things I'm doing now is I'm working with a guy named Ed Catmull, who is the founder and president of Pixar Films, who was, this guy has all the patents on ray tracing and all these beautiful ways of, and so he was surprised when he found out that he is aphantasic. He doesn't picture things in his head, and yet he founded Pixar Films, and he started studying this, and he made everybody in his office take this questionnaire, and it turns out that many of his best artists are aphantasic. They don't picture in their heads something. So anyway,
Fascinating.
But great question. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Also, I'm sorry, this isn't in the queue, but I would love to know what you're teaching in the Literature in the Brain class.
Yeah, I mean, really briefly, it's just taking everything like mental imagery, memory, time perception, all these issues, hitting them from the neuroscience point of view, everything we know, and then how that shows up in literature and what it means both for the authors and for the readers. I just as a side note, I also write fiction. And so this has been one of the most enjoyable classes for me to build up because it allows me to really think about fiction in some new ways and some new directions that no one has done yet in fiction. So
that is very cool. I would love to take that class. So you addressed the first part of this question, but by talking about why we dream. But the second part is asking, what about the role of sleep for something like learning a difficult skill, like playing the piano? Does that have anything to do with that?
Yeah. It turns out that we do lots of rehearsal all the time when we're sleeping, and also even when you're awake, there's rehearsal going on. So when you learn something new, you're constantly doing that. And you've all had this experience of doing something that you haven't done before, and then as you're trying to fall asleep, you're picturing that and you can't stop. Maybe possibly you dream about that and so on. So let me say, sleep in general has lots of different functions, and people argue about which functions fall under this umbrella and so on. But specifically, what I am addressing and bringing quantitative data to, which I don't think has ever been possible before, is why our system blasts activity back there every 90 minutes. And of course, because it's our visual cortex, we see. You don't actually need your eyes for seeing. You have full, rich visual experience when your eyes are closed at night. But because that's where the activity is going, we're having visual experience. Thanks.
Great. Okay. This next question is from Stephen, and he asks, if the brain map is a consequence of stimuli received from various parts of the body and senses, what determines, if anything, which part or sense wins for that piece of territory?
Great question. It all has to do with, it's two things. One is relevance, and one is the amount of data that's getting sent. So, you have, just as an example, like many more receptors in your fingertips. We're very sensitive for touch on our fingertips. And so that ends up having a bigger representation in the brain than, let's say, your thigh. But also relevance matters. So, there are many studies showing that if, I don't know, I'm doing some task and I get rewarded for distinguishing something on the back of my hand or something, then I will start having a larger real estate representation for the back of my hand because that data matters.
Got it. All right. Lester is asking about what causes the phantom vibrations that you might feel from like carrying your cell phone around all the time and feeling those actual vibrations. And if there's a way
it's
to
great.
remove that.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I addressed this about phantom cell phone, in the book, which is, so everyone knows this feeling where you feel like, oh, my phone just rang in my pocket. And then you realize your phone's not in your pocket, it's sitting over here. And you think, oh my gosh, why am I feeling as though I just felt the vibration of my cell phone? The general story is it's because the brain's trying to map out what's going on in the world, and it essentially has a landscape of things. So anything that's close to something, your brain interprets as, okay, this is the thing it was. And again, relevance really matters here because there's hardly anything more relevant than your cell phone now. And so anything that's a graze or a scratch or an itch or whatever, your brain says, oh, that must have been a cell phone ring, because that's the thing that it really cares about. And so that's what you interpret it as. There's a huge literature on this in language, which is to say, it doesn't matter exactly how I pronounce this letter. You'll say, oh, he must have meant an E and he must have meant a T and an A and whatever. We have essentially these valleys where any raindrop that hits here is going to flow down and get interpreted as whatever. And as far as how you can avoid it, no way to avoid it.
Good to know. Okay, Susan is asking, could neosensory be used for stroke survivors who have lost their sense of touch, which impacts their ability to grasp objects, as in using their hearing to hear the grip force?
That's interesting. You mean, that's a cool idea. I mean, if it's sure, you could, if you're just trying to transmit grip force, you can measure that and put that in here. I'll tell you this, what we have is, we have a number of projects going on, and we have so many things of like, hey, what if we tried this and this and this? So what we've done is opened up developer contests for this. And we have about 70 different developer entries going on at any given time where people are developing, for detecting electrical fields or detecting snoring or for like, quadriplegic patients to be able to feel what's going on the end of the robotic arm by putting the vibrations on them. We have lots of projects. So anyway, we have not done anything for stroke patients yet, but if that's something you ever want to try, just go to neosensory.com/developers, and we have an open API and software development kits for this.
That's very cool. Okay, Elaine would like to know if you could speak to some of the case studies in Livewired, such as the individual who added small magnets to their fingertips, and your thoughts about the future of bioenhancement.
Yeah, so this all falls under this category of feeding sensory data to the brain that it might not be used to, but it has no trouble figuring out. So putting magnets into the fingertips is something that several of my biohacker friends around here in the Bay Area have done. And then they can actually feel, like electromagnetic bubbles around the adapter or whatever, and they can have a different experience of electrical fields that way. They just figure it out. They're just feeling something different that no one else has access to. One of my colleagues, Peter Meyer, is, he has this thing called The Voice, which takes, for blind people, it takes the visual scene and translates it into an auditory landscape so that you can turn the visual scene into audio. And so it used to be a big device, but nowadays it's just this awesome Android app, and it's scanning the scene and turning it into sounds, and people can come to understand that way. So in the book, I list I have tons and tons of these examples, all of which feed the same lesson, which is it doesn't matter how you get the information to the brain, as long as you get it there, the brain will figure it out.
Great. Okay, Peter would like to know, how quickly do synaptic connections form and disconnect? Is it milliseconds, seconds, or hours?
Okay, great question. So it turns out that this can happen on the scale, certainly of seconds, where things are, I mean, certainly things are strengthening or weakening, and eventually things will unplug and seek around. And that can happen, anywhere between seconds and hours for that. But I promise to come back to this. The reason that you see such a fast takeover of the visual cortex by, let's say, hearing and touch is because you already have all kinds of cross wiring in the brain where things are connected everywhere, but they're normally silent. So in other words, in the visual system, you have hearing, you have touch. It's just that normally those are inhibited. So no problem. But what happens as soon as you get blindfolded or go to bed at night, what happens is that those start becoming unsilent. Those start becoming heard, so that you can get very fast takeovers that way. And then there's a much slower process that happens where you actually get the growth of new axons in there and the sprouting of new synapses. That's the slower process. Thank you for that question.
Okay, this anonymous attendee is asking, if someone goes blind later in life, do they no longer have visual dreams since that space gets taken away in the brain?
Great question. They do actually have visual dreams. So it turns out if you study the dreams of blind people and you divide them by when they went blind, if you go blind as an adult, you still have visual dreams. Why? It's because there's less plasticity as you grow older. And therefore, when you blow activity into this part of the brain, it's still interpreted as visual. For somebody who is born blind, their dreams have no vision. They don't even have a concept of vision. And so their dream is, oh yeah, I was walking through my living room and suddenly in the corner I felt a bear, and then all the furniture was in a different place and I tried to run, but it's all touch and so on. Why? Because that part of their brain has not experienced vision, and so it's just about touch and hearing and so on.
It's really interesting. Okay, apologies if I'm mispronouncing this, but Hanane is asking, how do you explain the difference between the functions of the right and left side of the brain? Those who just have one side hemisphere, how do they divide those functions in their brain?
Yeah, great question. So it used to be thought that the right and left sides were very different. And there's sort of this myth about, creativity and so, but that's not really true. The right way to think about this is that the two halves of the brain are essentially carbon copies of each other, with the slight exception that the left side of the brain is more involved in fine motor movements and the right side is more involved in gross movements. And there are some consequences of that. So language tends to be on the left side, which is much more about fine movements and so on. In the right side, for example, the language areas correspond to music areas, which are, slightly less refined in terms of the movements that are required. But the two hemispheres are very much alike. And so it turns out that given that duplication, you can get rid of one and the other one says, oh, I need to wire all the function. I need to make sure that I can control everything from here. And it does. And sometimes, by the way, I also have this example in the book, but sometimes a child is born with only one hemisphere. They just have one hemisphere. And it turns out that if you look at, I won't go into detail, but if you look at the way their visual system is normally mapped, normally in your visual cortex, this side of the world is on this half of the brain and this side of the world is on this half of the brain. But for a child who's only born with one hemisphere, both sides of the world get represented on that side of the brain. So again, this is a very different kind of thing than we're used to thinking about, okay, well, how would we program this machinery to work? This is a kind of machinery that is live wired that says, okay, I have to accomplish seeing the world and I don't have this hemisphere over here. Cool. I'm just going to make sure that all of this gets done in whatever real estate I have. Thanks for the question.
Peter is asking, cochlear implants nowadays have a few dozen channels and the Neosensory Buzz wristband currently has 4. What do you think would be the optimal channel count for the Buzz if there were no technology and cost limitations?
Yeah. It's interesting because with the vest, we had 32 or 64 motors, and that was really cool. We could do great detail there. But I'll tell you something, what we're doing here is we have 4 motors, but we use a haptic illusion, which means if I stimulate 2 neighboring motors, you will think that you're feeling a single virtual point in the middle. And as I change the amplitude of those 2 motors, I can move that virtual point around. So we're actually stimulating 128 virtual points along the wrist. Now, we don't know yet how good people will get at being able to discriminate one point from another. 128 might be too much, but that's what we're doing. So that's how we're using 4 motors, but actually putting in a lot more information than that. But if we had infinite good technology on this, I mean, the eyes have like 1 million neurons each sending information back. That's really high resolution. It'd be great to have 1 million motors.
Great. Okay, this anonymous attendee is asking, of all the trillions of species that have existed on this 4.5 billion year planet, only one, Homo sapiens, has evolved with a brain wired for symbolic connection. What changes in the brain make language possible?
So we've had a lot of changes in our brain. Let me just highlight 2 important things. One is our cortex, this wrinkly outer bit, expanded, really blew up. And one of the things that caused is the distance between sensory inputs and motor outputs. It causes to move further apart. So in most animals, you've got your input right next to your output. So if I throw, some food in front of a cat, it sees the stimulus, it's gonna eat it. But you throw food in front of a human and a human says, well, I'm on a diet, I'm not gonna eat it right now, whatever. We have all this interposed cortex that allows us to take different paths through it. And maybe we make the motor action, maybe we don't. Maybe we do something more clever and so on. That's one thing. The other big thing is this area right behind our forehead, the prefrontal cortex, is what allows humans to unhook from the here and now and exist in different points in time. So we spend most of our time simulating possible futures. What if, what could be? And this is a giant part of what has allowed our species to become what it is, because we're not hooked in the moment. As far as the details that make language possible, of course, that has to do with the details of the larynx as well. Things like that other animals don't have the opportunity to do, such subtle things that we can do with little puffs of air and shaping our mouth just right to get lots of information through.
Great. I'm going to end with this question, which says, I know it's a big question, but can you give us your view on consciousness, and will a robot ever be self-aware?
Yeah, the question of consciousness in neuroscience is just, how do you put together, 86 billion pieces and parts and ever have it become conscious, self-aware? Because if I take 86 billion Tinker toys and I hook them all up, it's not clear that I get to a point where I add one more Tinker toy and I say, now it's experiencing the taste of feta cheese and the beauty of a sunset and the feeling of pain and so on. So this is a completely unsolved question in neuroscience. And, I and a number of my colleagues are scratching at it in different ways and trying to get there. But we don't know. On the one hand, as far as we can tell, this is just made of pieces and parts, a huge number of them. And so therefore it should be replicable in a computer or a robot. But until we have the principle figured out, which we are at 0 right now, it's hard to say with any certainty.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for those questions. I'm sorry we don't have time to get to all of them, and I wish we could go on for another hour. David, do you have any closing thoughts for us?
I just want to say thank you very much for inviting me. And next time, I hope to be at the Harvard Bookstore in person.
Yes. Oh, I can't wait till we're back to regular in-person events, but I'm so glad that you could Zoom in from across the country. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Thank you, Alvaro, for joining us and for that wonderful introduction. And thank you to all of you out there on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, the Harvard University Division of Science, and the Harvard Library, all in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Have a great rest of your evening. Keep reading and be well. Thank you so much.